Good afternoon, everybody. I am Jessica Byron, former director of the Institute of International Relations, and it's my great pleasure and privilege to be moderating this webinar on Latin America and the Caribbean with you this afternoon. I'm also pleased to be here because I'm a proud alumna of the Institute of International Relations, and it is always a great pleasure to rejoin the Institute for various activities. I'm not going to spend much time at this point, apart from extending a very warm welcome to our panelists and also to our audience. But I just want to leave you with a quotation from a speech by a former president of a Caribbean country, President Forbes Burnham in Guyana, who, speaking in 1974 at the extended conference of CARICOM, when the three or four, I think it was, signatories of the first CARICOM treaty extended the grouping to include the less developed countries. At that time, they were not yet independent. And Forbes Burnham said, "How can we, Mr. Chairman, make an impact on the world as 13 little specks of dust? We must not, Mr. Chairman, I would suggest very humbly, limit the contributions we can make as a people to the conduct of affairs only within our region. We are part, first of all, of what is called Latin America. This region is part of a larger Latin American region. We are also part, Mr. Chairman, of the third world, that is what we now call Global South. That group of nations who in recent times have clearly enunciated their desire and determination to be truly independent, accepting at the same time the interdependence of all the countries and states of the world." I thought it was useful to recall sentiments like this because it emphasizes for us the significance of our place within a wider Latin American community and the importance of Latin America to the Caribbean and the importance of our joint international relations and cooperation. I will stop there and hand over to Dr. Montoute to do the official welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Byron, for your warm welcome, and it is very good to see you again and to have you back with us. Professor Jessica Byron, former director of the Institute of International Relations and chair of this webinar. Esteemed panelists, Mr. Michael Hendrickson, Economic Affairs Officer, Economic Development Unit, the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. Dr. Stacy Richards Kennedy, Regional Manager for the Caribbean Development Bank of Latin America and the Caribbean. Dr. Mark Curtin, Honorary Senior Fellow, Institute of International Relations, the University of the West Indies. Dr. Jacqueline LaGuardia Martinez, Senior Lecturer and MPhil PhD Coordinator, Institute of International Relations, and Professor Lancelot Cowie, Honorary Professor of Latin American Studies, Institute of International Relations. IAR and U.W.I colleagues, distinguished attendees, students, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to the Institute of International Relations Caribbean Policy Consortium webinar, Latin America-Caribbean Relations in a Multipolar World. The objective of this and other public events of the IAR is to promote discussions and exchange of ideas with a wider audience on a range of issues of relevance to the international relations of the Caribbean and regional development. These include diplomatic dialogues, panel discussions, special guest lectures, and book launches. The diversity of issues on which the IAR engages highlights, among many things, the multidisciplinary nature of our work, and the capacity we possess to bridge the gap between theory, policy, and practice. Importantly, these exercises promote public presence, generate knowledge, and advance the policy relevance of our work. The IR sometimes executes events collaboratively with both individuals and organizations, including high-level officials, persons who have made remarkable achievements in their field of work, the diplomatic corps, the private sector, research and policy agencies, and national and regional governmental and non-governmental organizations. One such collaboration is the Caribbean Policy Consortium, or CPC. The CPC is a consortium of academics, public officials, business persons, and advocates from the Caribbean and the United States. The group aims to raise the Caribbean's visibility in U.S. policy circles, influence attitudes, and promote knowledge about Caribbean concerns. The group also seeks to keep Caribbean people informed of major currents in the U.S. and globally which can affect the region. The objective is pursued through their writings and hosting of public discussions such as this one here today. To advance the agenda, the CPCs engage in cooperative arrangements with universities, including the University of the West Indies and Florida International University. This is the 6th seminar which has been held by the Institute and the CPC. Previous seminars have covered the areas of U.S.-Caribbean relations, Caribbean-Africa relations, the Haitian problematique, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Today, we are pleased to host this very important webinar with the CPC, Latin American Caribbean Relations in a Multipolar World. The Latin American Caribbean subregions can no longer be called distant cousins, as they were called in the period before the 1990s. Globalization and increasing interconnectedness have forced the two subregions to engage. This has been facilitated a great deal through regional organizations and institutions which comprise both Latin American and Caribbean member states. At the same time, several challenges, tensions, and even conflict exist in the relationship. In 2017, a research team from the Institute conducted a study for the EU-LAC Foundation with the objective of enhancing the Caribbean's role in the EU-LAC strategic partnership, and we concluded that identifying the areas of common interest is at the foundation of the factors which are likely to drive the relationship in a positive direction. The global and regional geopolitical environments play an important role in shaping these countries' interests. Shifting global distributions of power, the entry of wealthier developing countries into powerful groupings, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine, among many other developments, are all important to understanding the context in which Latin American Caribbean relations can be analyzed and understood. Having said that, I would just like to wish everyone a productive seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Montut, for that fulsome introduction to all of us. Now, I need to, first of all, just mention to our audience that we have a couple of changes. Our first speaker, Professor Andres Servín, unfortunately, because of a personal emergency, is unable to join us live this afternoon, but he has sent his presentation, and it's going to be my duty to summarize his thoughts on multipolarity and the role of Latin America and the Caribbean within that. So that is one. Dr. Curtin, we hope and believe, will be joining us. He is trying to connect. And unfortunately, Professor Griffiths, our CPC main representative, also has a personal emergency and cannot be with us this afternoon. But apart from that, we are in very good nick and we get underway right now. I am going to introduce the panelists in the order in which they are expected to speak or in which their presentations will be made. And after that, we will just proceed according to the program you have received. Our first presenter, at least by slides, is Professor Andres Servín. He is the chair and former executive president of CRIES, which is an organization that does research and also does quite a bit of civic action and presents analyses on policy issues affecting Latin America and the Caribbean. He is also the director of a research journal, Pensamiento Propio, of CRIES. And he is Argentinian and also spent many years of his life working in Venezuela. He is the recent recipient of the Global South Distinguished Scholar Award of the International Studies Association. And he's a founding member of the Venezuelan Institute of Social and Economic Research, the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, and he's a former president of the Caribbean Studies Association. Andres Servín retired as a full professor of the Central University of Venezuela, and since then he has been visiting professor at several universities in the United Kingdom, the United States, France, and Brazil, and he currently teaches at the Pontifical Catholic University of Argentina. In the past, he has been advisor to Venezuelan government ministries, particularly foreign affairs, and to SAILA, and he has been a consultant to various international organizations. He has authored several books and more than 200 academic articles in several languages. And his most recent book is on war and global transition. He speaks a bit about that while looking at Latin America and the Caribbean in the emerging global order in his slides. Our second speaker, Dr. Richards Kennedy, is an alumna of the Institute of International Relations, and she has over 25 years' experience in multilateral negotiations, development management, and international finance. She has extensive experience working with multilateral development agencies, including UNDP, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the World Bank. She also served as head of the U.W.I's Development Office and as Pro-Vice Chancellor for Global Affairs at the U.W.I. Dr. Richards Kennedy is currently the head of the Regional Management Office for the Caribbean of the Development Bank for Latin America and the Caribbean, affectionately known as the CAF. Stacy, we are very proud of you and very happy to welcome you here today. And she will speak on the role of international financial institutions in promoting regional integration and sustainable development in a multipolar world. Our third speaker, we hope, is Dr. Mark Curtin, a very much loved former interim director of the IIR. He has more than 40 years' experience of university teaching and research and administration. At the University of Guyana, he served as the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences and the head of various graduate and undergraduate departments before joining the U.W.I and serving for many more years as senior lecturer and researcher of Caribbean Latin American affairs. He also organized wonderful study tours for our students, staff, and alumni to Latin American destinations, Latin American and Caribbean destinations, and he directed the dissertations of several PhD candidates while at the IIR. Mark will speak on CARICOM at 50 and its strategic repositioning vis-a-vis Latin America and the Caribbean. Our fourth speaker is Dr. Jacqueline LaGuardia Martinez. Dr. Jacqueline is senior lecturer at the IIR since 2014. And before that, she was an associate professor at the University of Havana. Her teaching spans small states in the global system, the international relations of Latin America and the Caribbean, international political economy, and Cuban history. Dr. LaGuardia's research interests span IPE and cultural studies, and she is coordinator of our MPhil and PhD program in international relations. Dr. LaGuardia will speak on CELAC's role in Latin America and the Caribbean's regional integration. Our fifth speaker is Professor Lancelot Cowie. Professor Cowie lectured for 30 years at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, in Spanish and Latin American studies. He was founder and director of CENLAC, a Center for Latin America and Caribbean, between 2003 and 2016. Dr. Cowie's research and publications span a range of social and cultural themes in Latin America and the Greater Caribbean. Most recently, between 2016 and 2021, he served as Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago in Havana, Cuba. He is currently honorary professor attached to the Latin American Studies program at the IIR, and he will speak on Caribbean cultural relations with Latin America in this new era. And our final speaker is Dr. Michael Hendrickson. Michael Hendrickson is Economic Affairs Officer with the UN ECLA, based in Port of Spain. For over 29 years, he has worked on development issues in the Caribbean, among them the socio-economic impacts of natural disasters, resilience building strategies for small Caribbean states, trade and integration issues, and the impacts of fiscal policy and debt on sustainable development in this region. Mr. Hendrickson will speak on fostering socioeconomic development, trade, and investment relations in Latin America and the Caribbean. Welcome, Michael. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. So without any further ado, I will seek to present or to summarize Professor Serbian's PowerPoint presentation over the next 10 minutes. And after that, the presentations should flow in the order in which I have introduced the panelists. Can we start slide sharing, Jonathan? Please. Thank you very much. Now, Professor Serbian was planning to address us this afternoon on the concept of poly-crisis, that is multiple crises, and the new international order, the global south, the transition to some sort of new order and beyond. Next slide, please. And he starts by referring to Henry Kissinger, and incidentally, Professor Kissinger departed this world yesterday. So it's quite timely that we remember his considerable contribution, whether you think of it in positive or not so positive terms, to international relations. He certainly was a force to be reckoned with. And Henry Kissinger acknowledges emergence of a new world without defined characteristics. And this new world is defined largely by its uncertainty and by the disorderly transition that is preceding it. And of course, China and the United States and their competition is one of the focal points of this. So the key dynamics, as Andres Serbin sees it, first of all, the fact that China and the US both possess global power resources, and their activity will influence other multilateral responses. And the internal challenges affect both countries. In the case of the United States, its political polarization and its economic challenges. In the case of China, its recent economic slowdown and its changing demographics. Another key dynamic is the rise of what is called the Global South, which really refers to a very diverse set of emerging countries and coalitions. And the rise of the Global South is particularly important for Latin America and the Caribbean, in that it makes us question ourselves as to what is going to be our role in this new world order. And finally, we are going through a very complex transition because of the multiple crises that are taking place and because of the unpredictability about the future, the uncertainty. Next slide, please. So he continues by reflecting a little bit more on the challenges of polycrisis. I won't go too much into that, but I would like to highlight his focus on multilateralism and global governance, and the fact that these processes are in crisis. They are in crisis because of the geopolitical power shift and because of catastrophes like the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine. And even more so, the most recent international conflict between Israel and Gaza. Now, what is the role of the Global South? And the rise of the Global South is a significant new factor in this international transition because it challenges the existing liberal order. And recent summits of Global South actors, such as the BRICS and the G77 plus China, highlight the renewed and the ever-increasing important role of emerging economies and the fact that both geopolitical and geoeconomic realignments are taking place. Next slide, please. So Professor Serbin then looks at regional dynamics. The fact that Latin America and the Caribbean are struggling with their own unique challenges in the midst of all of this. The fact that there has been a general, regionalism has been going backwards in Latin America and the Caribbean. And more countries, despite that, are looking towards exercising greater autonomy in world affairs and exercising or figuring out for themselves what active non-alignment might look like. Now, the liberal order, which we all lived in and lived through for many years, is now facing significant challenges. And these challenges are possibly most evident in the crisis that is facing institutions of the liberal order, in the questioning of long-held international legal principles, and in all the challenges that global governance mechanisms are facing and institutions like the United Nations are facing. And the ongoing power transition and the complex global dynamics that are reshaping the international landscape challenge more and more the international liberal order. So for Latin America and the Caribbean, there are both opportunities in this situation, but there's also a significant amount of risk. And any responses from the region really require a very nuanced and very subtle understanding of all these dynamics. And the region's response also requires us to be proactive, not reactive, but to take initiatives in this evolving multipolar order and to prioritize South-South cooperation. Next slide, please. Now, part of the polycrisis is the crisis of neoliberal globalization and the re-emergence of geopolitics governing what we used to call economic globalization. So in terms of the global economy, there is a shift of dynamic of, the main dynamics fueling the global economy from the Atlantic to the Asia Pacific. China's sustained growth and the growth of other economies in Asia has really lifted and led the entire global economy over the last decade at least. And Eurasia, that is parts of Europe, Central Europe into Asia, and Asia Pacific, they are following their own path of cooperation. This path is led by China and to a lesser extent by Russia. Now, the changing dynamics of these shifts may also include the fact that emerging economies aspire to be rule makers and not to passively accept the traditional roles assigned to them within the international liberal order. And neoliberal globalization, its crisis, is leading to all sorts of debates on deglobalization, or parallel globalizations, etc. What is happening is that you have the rise of competing trade blocs. And in this competition, China and Russia and the US-led West are the major players, while regional powers try to promote regional spheres of influence. Regional powers in the Pacific, Asia, and regional powers in parts of Africa, etc. All of this has increased the fragmentation of the old order, and established multilateral mechanisms are in crisis. And you have seen in that context a greater role being played by informal forums, such as the G20 and the G7 and the BRICS. And then, of course, there are recent developments, such as the struggles of the global economy to restart itself after the pandemic. Next slide, please. Yeah. So global fragmentation is manifested in terms of geoeconomics. You have an Atlanticist, that is the West European American narrative associated with the liberal international order, but this is being challenged by Eurasian, Asia Pacific, and Global South narratives. And the Global South narratives are gaining in significance. They are a decisive factor, but a bit uncertain in terms of the global transition. And social media, of course, amplifies the complexity and probably the misinformation shaping the global transition. And it's very important for all of us to understand and to analyze all these diverse narratives in order to have a comprehensive grasp of the geopolitical transformations that are taking place. Next slide, please. Yeah, where is the global south in all of this? Well, greatly affected by the impact of COVID-19. Despite that, global south nations are seeking greater cooperation beyond existing multilateralism. There are more accentuated differences between the global south and the West nowadays, partly due to Western sanctions on Russia, partly due to negative repercussions of sanctions on all global south countries, and partly due to global south differences with Western positions in conflicts like Ukraine and Israel, Hamas. So the multipolar world is even more fragmented. There's a shift of economic power to Asia. BRICS is an alternative bloc to the G7, and it has proposed a lot of reforms in global governance. And the global fractures, as I just mentioned, are deepened by the wars. And this has fostered greater non-alignment in the global south. So you have different reactions from global south nations. Some of them are acting as swing states. They are pursuing pragmatic policies, and they are marking their differences from the Western powers, while the West narrative tries to emphasize a unipolar world. Next slide, please. Now, what are the challenges and limitations facing the global south? Most of these stem from heterogeneity and disparities and new questions of identity. So it's difficult to translate global south agendas both within the North and within their own context. It's difficult to articulate common perspective and to overcome the limitations in global south cooperation and trade. 2023 marks the year of the rise of informal multilateral institutions, mostly led by global south actors. And the complexity of this transition means that we have to try to understand the roles of various actors, North, South, East, and West, on multiple levels. We have to try to understand the global South's role in this multipolar transition and how it can have a role despite its diversity and its complexities. The fragmentation of the present international dynamic requires very nuanced analyses. We have to go beyond the simplified notions such as the Cold War. Next slide, please. And Professor Serbian, he's wrapping up now. He speaks about the resistance of the global North, and how they view the rest of the world. They have realized there's a reluctance of African, Asian, and Latin American leaders to align with the US and NATO in the Ukraine conflict. And similarly, the Gaza conflict is raising new alignments in the global South. I don't know how many of you noticed, but Belize has broken off relations with Israel in last week, that's one of our Caribbean countries. The key players, the global North perceives that the global South is not really vital to US interests as a whole. And so the North, and the United States in particular, tends to focus on targeting potential allies or regional blocs within the global South. Russia has quite a lot of influence over non-aligned countries, and that has lasted, which means that there are other points of fragmentation. And China's global strategy focuses on the global south. And there are questions about how far the convergence of Russia and China goes. Are they both global south actors, and are they unified global south actors? It's not entirely clear. The global south collective agenda relates to development issues, global public goods issues, overcoming poverty, managing inflation, external debt, and combating climate change. There's a strong emphasis on seeking informal multilateral responses because of the crisis of multilateralism. The US tends to try to keep the global south peripheral in global governance processes. And despite its heterogeneity, global south nations resist marginalization, and they seek to gain independence and autonomy. And they realize that they have growing power to influence global affairs, particularly on issues that challenge the West. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is the conclusion. There's a broad spectrum of problems and challenges characterizing the transition. The emergence of the global south is reshaping the global power map. The Caribbean and Latin America are all experiencing the impacts of the polycrisis and of global transition. And there are a number of narratives in Latin America and the Caribbean that are shaping agendas. Most of these narratives reference the global south. There are also growing aspirations for autonomy. The region aspires for a break from marginalization and for greater autonomy. The region also aspires to develop non-aligned positions and to actively navigate global dynamics. I think that is the last slide. Jonathan, is there another slide? Ah, yes, this is the last slide. On this one, I would just focus on two things. Professor Serbian ends with, three main points. New paradigms are needed to understand the global transition. National interests and aspirations clash with the concept of a global south because it's a very diverse global south. Latin America and the Caribbean are actively responding to global transformations. And a key question is there room for a common agenda vis-a-vis global transition among Latin American and Caribbean countries? How can a common agenda be articulated? How can there be a pseudo-globalist narrative that has broader objectives amid all the uncertainties that currently cloud the horizons? Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Serbian, for giving us these thoughts this afternoon. Dr. Stacy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Byron, and greetings to everyone who has joined us this afternoon. I'll just wait a few moments for the presentation to be loaded. And while that is being done, let me, at the onset, thank the organizers for inviting me and inviting CAF to be part of this important discussion. It is a triple honor for me to represent CAF. Firstly, as a proud alumna of the U.W.I St. Augustine campus, also as a graduate of the Institute of International Relations, and thirdly, as a former member of the executive management team for the Regional University of the West Indies. In this presentation, I will focus on the crucial role that international financial institutions play in advancing integration and sustainable development, and why this is even more essential at our current moment in history. Multilateralism, development cooperation, and interregional dialogue are the pillars upon which the post-World War II global order has been built and maintained, with multilateral development banks, of course, being important actors in this space. So moving to the next slide, you'll see that I have structured my presentation under 5 main topics. And I'll share some salient points on each of these during the time allotted to me. Firstly, I'll focus on multilateral banks and just giving a brief definition and overview of the significance in terms of the role that they play. Secondly, focus on the promotion of integration and the role of multilateral banks like CAF that are dedicated to promoting integration specifically. Thirdly, strengthening regional collaboration for a resilient future, why this is important for Latin America and the Caribbean in terms of integration and the work that CAF is doing. Then I'll go specifically into discussing CAF as a multilateral development bank with a few highlights on the work that we do, and then finally round us off with a short overview of CAF's partnership with Trinidad and Tobago and our deepened engagement with the wider English-speaking Caribbean. On to the next slide. Let me just start us off by talking a little bit more about multilateral banks. These banks serve as crucial financial entities, particularly for developing countries. Their primary functions include providing financial and technical support through a range of financial instruments, such as loans, grants, lines of credit, guarantees, bonds, but also other types of financing, such as structured or parallel financing, co-financing, and many others. These investments support diverse projects across a range of sectors, including infrastructure, education, and healthcare, just to name a few. But also, it's important to note that the multilateral banks offer technical assistance and policy advice to both governments and private sector clients. Now, CAF, which is the acronym for the Spanish name for our organization, Corporación Andina de Fomento, is one of the international financial institutions operating in Latin America and the Caribbean, alongside other prominent institutions, some of which are featured on the slide, like the World Bank, IDB, the CDB, the European Investment Bank, and Afro-Exim Bank, which all play pivotal roles in promoting economic development of Latin America and Caribbean countries. Next slide, please. Now, when we look at the promotion of integration specifically, multilateral banks promote different types of integration between countries and regions in several ways. A key example, which is at the core of CAF's mandate and in our DNA, as we like to say, is support for physical integration and strengthened interconnectivity to support transport, trade, tourism, and the mobility of goods and persons by financing regional infrastructure projects such as roads, bridges, ports, airports, and many others. And in so doing, CAF helps to enhance the connectivity and reduce the transportation costs, acting as an important bridge between different countries. But we also support targeted projects that help to promote economic integration and functional integration, depending on the priorities that have been identified by the different countries. Some examples include projects that contribute to facilitating regional infrastructure development. I mentioned that earlier. Others foster energy integration or empower regional trade and investment initiatives. Others have to standardize regulations for cross-border cooperation, increased private sector collaboration between countries. And then we also have several partnership agreements and technical assistance projects to support regional organizations. Moving to the next slide, I'd like to just expand on this a bit more, because having touched on the nature and function of multilateral banks in general, let me now provide you with an insider look into CAF and our unique mandate. As you'll see on the slide, a distinguishing feature of CAF is that from its very establishment in 1970, some 53 years ago, regional integration was a core pillar of the institution's mandate, together with sustainable development. And these pillars continue to underpin the work of our institution, and of course, as we see, continue to be extremely relevant to the development processes of our region. Another important point is that CAF is a homegrown indigenous development bank situated in the global south, with its ownership residing among Latin America and Caribbean countries, thus serving as a vital resource for shaping the development trajectory of the countries in this region. Next slide, please. CAF currently has 19 shareholder countries from Latin America and the Caribbean, and 2 shareholder countries from Europe, namely Spain and Portugal. All member countries, regardless of geographic location, size, or GDP per capita, can access financing from CAF for their development projects. There's no graduation criteria or restrictions to funding based on middle income or high middle income status. Given CAF's governance structure, with its representatives of full member countries serving as directors of the board of CAF and taking decisions about the approval of projects and the allocation of the bank's resources in the region, CAF has been recognized as a very agile and flexible organization that is serving in a very effective way to support countries with advancing their development priorities and also achieving the sustainable development goals. Next slide, please. As such, CAF has a deep understanding of the history, the connections, and the development issues facing its member countries, and it shares their commitment to the region's development and progress, helping countries in the global south to seize opportunities and to tackle the development challenges that they face. Our effectiveness is based on many factors, including, and as you'll see on the slide, a shared history and the deep connections between Latin America and the Caribbean, mutual benefits in that the bank allows countries to take advantage of the abundant energy resources, diverse goods, and strategic logistical infrastructure. For example, the Panama Canal, which was a major project for CAF to strengthen the region's connectivity with Asia and the Pacific. The Caribbean, therefore, stands to reap economic benefits from tourism, financial services alongside Latin American countries. Shared vulnerabilities, that's something that both regions experience, so Latin America and the Caribbean facing common challenges, and this includes the susceptibility to natural disasters, of course, the impact of the climate crisis, and then, of course, the economic reactivation following the pandemic. Economic imperative is important because integration is crucial to promoting sustainable development and enhancing economic resilience. Therefore, CAF's work is helping to achieve and to promote inclusive growth as well as prosperity for all of the countries in the region. So CAF is playing a pivotal role in supporting integration by providing financial and technical assistance, but also by promoting dialogue and collaboration among regional stakeholders. We help the region also to leverage funding from global funds like the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the Global Environment Fund, because CAF is an accredited entity with these global funds. And recently we were able to approve a $10 million grant from the Adaptation Fund for Trinidad and Tobago in collaboration with the Ministry of Planning and Development. So let me just emphasize here the point about the role that the multilateral development banks play. These international financial institutions are in a unique position to bring together funding, knowledge, ideas, projects, and political will by convening policy and decision makers. The banks also play a catalytic role in moving development programs and projects forward that help to advance integration and sustainable development in the region. Next slide, please. I'm going to go a bit more quickly because I know time is not on our side. Just an overview of CAF. On this slide, we see some at-a-glance institutional facts about our bank as a multilateral bank dedicated to promoting regional integration and sustainable development. As I mentioned, we're an indigenous development bank created by Latin America and the Caribbean for Latin America and the Caribbean, promoting regional solutions through global connections. We have preferred creditor treatment, and we have also very high investment grade credit ratings. So the financial strength of the bank allows for continuous support from shareholders and a robust capital base for then making additional financial investments in our member countries. Next slide, please. Moving quickly to just show a quick distribution of the loan operations across our borrowing countries, and also distributed by private as well as public sector operations. Next slide, please. CAF has had a steady journey of partnership with Trinidad and Tobago over the past 29 years. Trinidad and Tobago was the first country from the English-speaking Caribbean to join CAF in 1994, and there has been a consistent growth in the portfolio of the country with CAF being the leading development partner for the country. In September last year, the decision was taken to establish a regional office for the Caribbean. This is a decision that was taken by CAF's management, and the host country, Trinidad and Tobago, is where the regional office is based. And this builds on the excellent partnership and will serve and has been serving to increase and channel development financing to other CARICOM countries, particularly given the need for economic revitalization coming out of the pandemic and the need for greater support for sustainable and inclusive development. The regional office is therefore focusing its efforts on strengthening the engagement with CARICOM countries, deepening the partnership with regional institutions already existing in the Caribbean through MOUs that we already have with different entities such as the U.W.I. and the Caribbean Export Development Agency, CARICOM Development Fund, but also with the Association of Caribbean States, for example, and other agencies, international agencies that are global, but also work in the region, such as UNDP, UNECLAC, and many, many more. Importantly, the regional office will serve as the bridge between Latin America and the Caribbean, facilitating knowledge exchange, collaboration, and sharing of project experiences between both subregions. So on the next slide, I'll just mention that Jamaica is also a member of CAF and has been a member since 1999. Barbados became a member in 2014, and CAF is continuing to strengthen partnerships with other multilaterals that are working in the Caribbean with a view to providing complementary financing for development challenges facing our regions. As you know, the issues such as climate change, renewable energy transition, citizen security, human development, water and food security, all of these require significant levels of investment over sustained periods of time, and no one multilateral bank can do this alone. Therefore, for us, we are very much committed to SDG 17, which is working in partnership with other multilaterals and other development actors to help countries achieve their development goals. And I'd just like to end my presentation with that point, which really underscores the important role that international financial institutions play in bringing together ideas, decision-making, funding, and projects that will then come together to support the integration efforts and tackle multidimensional development challenges, even as there are shifts in the wider ecosystem and in the wider, diplomatic relations and interstate relations internationally. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and I hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richards Kennedy, for that presentation. I'd like to mention that Dr. Mark Curtin has just joined us, and he will go straight into his presentation. Welcome, Mark. Pleasure to have you.
I want to begin by apologizing for the late entry, which basically, I'm in Brazil. As you know, we're in the throes of what might be an existential threat to some of us, and we are looking to ensure that we can sensitize as many of our allies as is possible. Now, in my 10 minutes, I plan to look at the traditional links between Latin America and the Caribbean, and to say in the beginning that one could argue here that the impact of colonial bilateralism, the issues of differences in size, language, and culture, constrained the emergence of very strong linkages early in the post-independence period of small Caribbean states. One could argue here that in the 1960s, as the Caribbean gained its independence, one saw not necessarily significant concern by Latin America. It didn't rank high on the hierarchy of concern for Latin American states. And indeed, especially in small states like Guyana, where we had independence, but at independence we had the presence of border controversies with two of our neighbors, Suriname and Venezuela, which Venezuela is still on today. We saw where there was an effort to diversify relations, moving to enhance our linkages with Brazil, even though it was still under military rule. We saw Guyana and some of the states of the region moving to enhance their multilateral relations with using the non-aligned movement, the Commonwealth, and other institutions, international institutions, to kind of ensure that the moving of interdependence ensure that they could have other linkages established. Now, I want to fast forward to the period, maybe the 1990s, where we saw the establishment of the West Indian Commission. In its report, Time for Action, it indicated clearly the need for widening and deepening the integration movement at one and the same time. And one could see here the wisdom in that approach, in that it was necessary, became necessary, especially in the changing global and regional environment, to have that kind of widening, which could have brought, or which should bring, according to the wise men of the Caribbean at the time, which should have brought increased interaction, collaboration, and economic partnerships with the wider Caribbean. So one could say here that the Caribbean was, the thinking of the Caribbean at the time was for widening the integration effort. And while the ACS had as its major areas of focus trade, transportation, tourism, and disaster management, one saw that perhaps as overlapping with some of the basic principles and practices and tenets of CARICOM. So we had that kind of, I think I could argue here that there was some overlap. And I would also argue that the ACS has lost its rhythm. And while there have been efforts now to revitalize it, with Mexico and Cuba being, I think, very important actors and players in the process, one would want to look at the possibilities of increasing levels of collaboration in those areas, because I see Latin America and the Caribbean as having important collaborative engagements necessary, especially in areas like disaster management, where we see that SEDEMA, the Caribbean Disaster and Emergency Management Agency, has not been well funded. And therefore, I think we ought to have, and that would be one recommendation coming out of this, that we have a stronger collaborative engagement with the agencies in Latin America, which can provide the kind of experience and expertise. I know that Cuba has had significant experience in the area, and therefore, when the concept of El Gran Caribe, one could see that as a possibility. So I think that while the ACS has not been as productive as one might have expected, I think we can look for a new beginning, so to speak, with the support of some of the member states, which seem to have new interest in the area. Now, I also want to look at the issues related to what happened next. By the 21st century, we saw areas of the integration being important, Latin American and Caribbean, and we saw the introduction of CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, and I think that one of my colleagues on the panel will be addressing that more specifically. But I think it is important to note that CARICOM became one of the quartet of countries, so to speak, added to the quartet, added to the trio of countries quite recently, which would oversee CELAC. Now, once again, I see a loss of momentum, but it is interesting to observe that this year, the chairman of CELAC, the pro tempore chairman of CELAC, is Caribbean person in the context, in the person of Prime Minister Gonzalez of St. Vincent. So it gives us the opportunity, I believe, to revitalize or to push the process further so that we can have a more structured engagement with CELAC, which has its own challenges based on some of the ideological and other differences which emerge. Now, I believe also that there are some areas where it's necessary for us to engage Latin America. One of them is the area of security, and I think that our discussion at the end, Professor Griffith, is more than suitable to discuss that issue. But I believe that as small states caught in the middle between demand and supply states, and having to move resources away from some productive activities to dealing with issues of job trafficking, that we need to explore the possibilities of an enhanced relationship with Latin American states in relation to job trafficking, people trafficking, trafficking in arms, etc. So that gives us the opportunity, I believe, that would be my recommendation again, to look to see the extent to which, in the context of CELAC, there could be increased interaction in that area. The fight against drug trafficking and people smuggling, etc. It is also important, I believe, to look at some areas, including food security. Now, we've noted that that in the Caribbean, there's more than what, 3.5 billion US dollars per year imported of agriculture and other products imported for that service sector, and that we see the possibility of stronger linkages with Latin America again in agricultural development. Now, it would require, I believe, especially we see countries in the northern South America, Guyana and Suriname and Belize as being in a position to ensure that we can have that kind of interaction and kind of movement, not only in agriculture, but value-added projects in the products in the agri sector. So agriculture, I believe, is also a key area. Energy is another area. Now, what I've seen recently is that there seems to be a dependence on petrochemical products, which has left the Caribbean or CARICOM fragmented in a sense, to my mind. It is in this context, as I think, that we may want to look at for consideration by CARICOM the restructuring of PetroCaribe to include new oil-producing states, Guyana, and soon to be oil-producing Suriname, and perhaps to consider using the refinery arrangements, the refinery facilities in Trinidad to have a reworked PetroCaribe, which will not have the reliance on one state, but could broaden the scope of participation and ensuring that there's a strong energy policy. At the same time, we know that some Latin American states have experience in areas like ethanol in the case of Brazil. So a robust energy policy in the Caribbean, which embraces the linkages with Latin America, could, I believe, be of a very positive impact on Latin American Caribbean relations. It is also, for me, important to note that the areas, especially education, have not necessarily been very strongly supported in terms of interaction. And so it leaves a level of misunderstanding and perhaps promotes some levels of mistrust. And therefore, I would recommend here again that there be more or stronger linkages through education exchanges between Latin American universities and those of the Caribbean. At the diplomatic level, we've seen where Caribbean representation in Latin America is not strong. And one might want to have a look at joint representation of CARICOM in those states in Latin America which don't have individual state representation at the embassy level. And that too, to my mind, can form the basis for closer collaboration. The area of trade, and I'm sure there are persons on the panel who have more experience in the areas to talk about that. But I've seen where there's a significant imbalance. And because of this limited collaboration, I think we don't understand in the region maybe the taxation issues. We have problems with transportation, supply, and therefore those two must be addressed urgently by the Caribbean community. I want to ask you for a brief moment to look, for me to look just for a few minutes at this recent issue with Guyana and Venezuela. We have been subject here to some unprecedented action in relation to the border controversy between Guyana and Venezuela. As you may be aware, since the 1960s, there's been significant dialogue as a result of the claim of invalidity of the 1899 arbitral award by Venezuela. There have been several processes, including the good officer process. We've had the Protocol of Port of Spain between 1970 and 1982, brokered by our CARICOM, our Caribbean colleague, our Caribbean Prime Minister, Eric Williams, which attempted to, in a sense, put in cold storage for a while and to seek to de-escalate some of the tensions. Now, not much progress has been made. Over 60 years, we've seen where there have been aggressive acts. As early as 1966, when Venezuela took over the Guyana half of Ancoco Island, which was awarded to then British Guyana as part of the 1899 arbitral award. And here we have Venezuela today annexing and occupying that island. We've also observed the kinds of provocations and aggressive acts. Over 60 years, we've seen the seizure of Guyanese vessels. We've seen the movement of troops on the borders. We've also seen where, as late as 2013, the Guardia Nacional of Venezuela seizing a seismic research vessel. And therefore, it was not surprising, or it should not be surprising to anyone, that in 2015, Guyana approached the Secretary General of the United Nations, having seen that there was no progress and exhausting all of the issues, all of the potential solutions, moved to the United Nations, first to Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and then to Secretary General Guterres, who agreed, well, using the authority vested in him on Article 33 of the United Nations Charter, and also in the context of the Geneva Agreement in 1966, agreed with Guyana that the International Court of Justice should be the final adjudicator in this issue. Twice, as a result of Venezuela's view that the court had no jurisdiction, twice the International Court of Justice had to rule that they do have jurisdiction and will indeed adjudicate on this matter. And the issue of the claim is before the International Court of Justice. And we believe that the final result should be complied with by both parties. So we go now to 2023, where we see once again another or a most unprecedented act, where Venezuela on Sunday, December 3rd, will ask its people in what I term some leading questions to give the Venezuelan government the authority to annex nearly 5/8 of Guyana and to create Essequibo, Guyana. Now, while one might believe in some ways that only has implications for Guyana, I believe that any instability which occurs as a result of that border issue can have serious repercussions, not only in the Caribbean, but in Latin America itself. In the first place, I think that once you see instability, and already I've seen where the stocks of some companies are reducing as a result of that tension. We've seen where indeed there could be some economic partnerships being constrained if there's any kind of movement that would bring into force that movement to annex. We also see when countries like Brazil would have to rework or reorder its borders both with Guyana and Venezuela. So we could see some instability even in our neighborhood, so to speak. And I believe that at this stage, there ought to have been a more robust CARICOM support, unequivocal support for Guyana. And I've called before, and I believe it was not necessarily answered. I've called for an urgent emergency meeting of CARICOM, where we can discuss as the only item on the agenda the issue of the border controversy, and to ensure that the support base is not fragmented. Now, in relation to this claim, we have to be very concerned as the people of Guyana. I would hope that there's not any action that would destabilize both Guyana and the region, and that we can ask that our sister states of Latin America and brother states in the Caribbean ensure that this region continues to be a zone of peace. Ghana is not an aggressor. Ghana is a victim at this stage. And we indeed have to recognize and continue to do so, that our first line of defense is diplomacy. We cannot compete militarily. We would not want to have a theater of war. We cannot afford to have one state come and, quote unquote, in their national interest, intervene. I would also call for, if any kind of action has to be taken, that a multilateral mission, a multilateral military deterrence mission, and I say multilateral because I believe that there should be a broadened regional security system, which is right now only the RSS is a small and only has a few CARICOM states, but I think the larger states may also have an input or should also have an input. And I believe that with the broader Latin America Caribbean connection, we can have a force, humanitarian, deterrent force. And I believe that countries like Brazil could lead, because Brazil has the experience of MINUSTAH, which was a UN-sponsored Haitian stabilization effort. And while the experiences have not been all positive, I think that Brazil can play a role in this regard. So I want to leave you with the hope that we can count on, as Guyana, count on the support of all of our Caribbean and Latin American brothers and sister states, and that in the process ensure that we continue to have this zone of peace, and that we could continue to develop together to ensure that the quality of lives of our people, both of Latin America and the Caribbean, are enhanced. Thank you very much.
Hi, good afternoon. I believe this is my turn now. So thank you very much to all the panelists, and I will try to cover as quick as possible on my topic. I'm really happy that we have an opportunity with this webinar to engage in such deep and important discussions that are engaging Latin America and the Caribbean today. And as Dr. Kirtan was indicated, I'm going to be also talking about the Latin American relationships in terms of regional integration, regionalism, and specifically the SELAC experience. We have already talked about the different polycrises thanks to Professor Byron and what Professor Servin has sent. And part of this polycrisis also extend, I believe, to the process of regionalism and the way we understand regionalism in the Americas. And as part of the transformations in the way of understanding regionalism and the way of practicing regionalism is that we can see that in 2011, CELAC was created. So what is CELAC? We are talking about the community of Latin American and Caribbean states. And the first thing I would like to highlight here is that this is a quite ambitious project for Latin American and Caribbean relations and Latin American and Caribbean integration, because this is the only mechanism in the region that brings together all Latin American and Caribbean countries, with the exception, as you can see, in the Americas, the exceptions that are not part of this mechanism are the United States and Canada. So this is a group of the Global South, a group of developing countries that are all sharing the geographical space of the Americas. Another important thing about CELAC that is also a challenge for this community to work and to be more effective on addressing the many challenges that we are facing is the fact that we are not talking about an international organization. CELAC is a regional mechanism. And as a mechanism, there is a lot of flexibility that allows it to act and allows it to have an influence and to engage with extra-regional actors, but also it has challenges to perform, because it is lacking a real supranational authority, is lacking even a strong institutionalization process that could make CELAC more effective. And if I have to do a first recommendation for Latin American and Caribbean relations and Latin American and Caribbean regionalism to advance, will be to work in terms of making CELAC stronger and giving this mechanism the capacity of actually having an influence and act a little bit more as with the mandate of what an international organization should be. Now, moving on CELAC, on the Caribbean in CELAC, this is another point here to highlight. Usually when we talk about CELAC, we only think about Latin America. But if we look at the membership of CELAC, it's quite evident that the Caribbean holds almost 50% of the membership of CELAC. And this is very important because CELAC is an institution, it's a mechanism. I have to correct myself. It's a mechanism that works with the power of the dialogue, the power of consensus, and definitely one country, one voice, one position is quite important. And CARICOM is going to bring 14 votes, is going to bring 14 positions within CELAC, and 14 out of 33 is quite significant. And if we understand the Caribbean, not only as CARICOM, but as the group of Caribbean seats, or CARIFORUM, then from 14, we will have 16, because we will be adding Cuba and the Dominican Republic. So the force of the Caribbean in the CELAC mechanism is something that I believe has not been clearly understood, not by Latin America nor by the Caribbean. And I believe that in a process of relaunching CELAC, that is something that we are seeing today, this is also an important element to consider. How the Caribbean could play a more important role within CELAC, and how the Caribbean could actually be more relevant on bringing and pushing for CELAC positions out of the region. Now, why CELAC? Why CELAC is important for the Caribbean? What has done CELAC since 2011 when it was created for the Caribbean? Why the Caribbean should care about CELAC as a mechanism to engage productively with its Latin American neighbors? I believe there are a few reasons for it. First, we need to understand that CELAC has been quite relevant in terms of engaging with extra-regional actors. And here I have two examples. CELAC has been recognized as the regional mechanism to engage in a regional dialogue with the European Union. The way that the European Union has decided to engage in a regional conversation with the Americas is through CELAC. And even in the case of China, CELAC has proven to be an interesting forum. And I'm talking about, and I'm highlighting this because let us remember that in Latin America and the Caribbean, we still have 7 countries that do not have diplomatic relations with China. So even if there is this tremendous obstacle for this regional dialogue between China and CELAC, China has found the ways to have a conversation with CELAC. So definitely this is giving us a signal that CELAC has relevance and has recognition out of the region. And this is a strong point that we should consider, especially when thinking about the polycrisis that Dr. Servin was indicating at the beginning. There has been efforts for relaunching CELAC, and we can see a very clear emphasis coming from Mexico in the 6th summit that was held in 2021. This is a moment from 2021, we can see that there has been an effort to rescue CELAC, to relaunch CELAC after a few years of CELAC being kind of dormant and having little impact in intra-regional and inter-regional dynamics. The Caribbean in CELAC has been recognized and has been supported in many of its specific development challenges. And this is something that also has to be recognized. CELAC has been issued several declarations that are looking at a specific interest of the Caribbean. I'm thinking about issues as climate change or the CARICOM reparation commissions. And another important fact is that since 2014, the CARICOM has a permanent seat in the quartet or the Troika +1. So yes, there are possibilities for the Caribbean to enhance its role and its participation within CELAC. Moving on, here we have another elements that I believe the Caribbean could bring to make CELAC stronger in these efforts of relaunching the regional mechanism. In the slides by Dr. Servin, we understood that there are major geopolitical and global shifts in international relations. And in the case of the Americas, we can see that the whole region, Latin America and the Caribbean, are losing weight in global politics. The axis of interest has moved from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So if there is a moment for the whole region and for Latin American and Caribbean relations to be rescued, the moment is now. Because in terms of the new times, it seems that there is less room for the whole hemisphere to play a role. At the same time, the Caribbean has strong points to bring to this relationship with Latin America. The Caribbean is recognized as a moral leader in key issues of the global agenda, as for instance, the climate change negotiations and even the proposals that are coming from the Caribbean to the reform of the international financial architecture. And the Caribbean has an interesting networking that Latin America does not have. And I'm thinking about Caribbean engagement within AOCs, within the Commonwealth, within the seats. So all of that could be part of the Caribbean strong points to actually play a major role within CELAC and to bring something new that could dynamize this presence of the whole Latin American region. I'm going then to move very quickly to 2 examples of this possibility for CELAC to actually regain a momentum in recent times and in the new global dynamics. After 8 years, the European Union and CELAC met again. The 3rd EU-CELAC summit was held in 2023. There has been about 8 years since the celebration of the 2nd summit. So there is an effort that is quite clear from both blocs to actually relaunch the bilateral regional relationship, the strategic, as they call it, the strategic partnership. In this meeting, it is interesting to see that there are signals that are showing us that the Caribbean is attempting to regain a main role. We see that there was a meeting just for Caribbean representative with the European Union representative, where the specific development challenges that the Caribbean has were put into the discussion. And also in the final declaration, it is also interesting to notice that Caribbean specific demands were included. Maybe not on the extent that was expected, but it is good to see that the Caribbean was recognized as a specific actor as part of this relation. Another interesting sign is also the recognition of CELAC by China. Again, I have already said that it is quite difficult for China to have a more formal and institutionalized space for exchanging with CELAC, considering that they are 7 CELAC members that do not have diplomatic relationships with China. But nevertheless, this forum has proven the capacity of CELAC. It means the capacity of the whole Latin American and Caribbean region to try to engage in deeper regional cooperation with China, that, as we know, is a major actor not only as an economic power but also as a cooperation partner. So I'm going to conclude with this slide. What do we need, or what do I propose we should be paying attention in this moment for Latin American and Caribbean relations, and especially within the framework of CELAC? There are countries in the Caribbean that holds a very clear dual cultural identity, and we might use them as countries that can actually make more fluid this exchange between Latin American and the Caribbean within CELAC and out of CELAC. I'm thinking about Cuba, Dominican Republic, Belize, Guyana, Suriname. Here you can see why, because of their location, because of their culture, because of the history. So they can act as this connection to try to make more fluid and more and stronger the relation between Latin American and the Caribbean. And I also would like to, and I would like then to end, just not to take so much time, I would like to end with the relevance of CELAC. And by CELAC, I'm meaning the relevance on Latin American Caribbean relations to make the region a more resilient space, especially in the very difficult times we are living. And I'm going to mention 2 urgent issues that I believe CELAC and by extension, Latin American and the Caribbean should be working together. First, Haiti. The situation in Haiti deserves a real commitment, not only from the Caribbean countries, but also for the large Latin American and Caribbean community. And definitely, as Dr. Kirton was mentioning, the new discussions that are re-emerging about the Guyana and Venezuela border controversy. This is not the only conflict that we have dormant in the region, and I believe that CELAC should play a larger role trying to facilitate a conversation and dialogue, because as Dr. Kirton said, the first tool that we need to use is the diplomatic channels to make sure that neighbors can talk and do not escalate a situation that we don't want to see out of control. Just finalizing, reminding that within CELAC, the Latin American and the Caribbean region has been recognized as a zone of peace since 2014. And also that within CELAC, in the Caracas Declaration of 2011, it has been approved by all CELAC members that common values and principles, they include respect for international law, self-determination, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, peaceful settlement of disputes, the prohibition of the use and the threat of the use of force, non-interference in international affairs, and the protection and promotion of human rights and democracy. I will stop here, and I hope to continue the discussions in the question and answer session.
Dr. Cowie, I think you're the next speaker.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to share some views on the question of cultural cooperation and its incentive in bringing our peoples together. Caribbean and Latin American cultural diplomacy refers to the use of cultural exchange and engagement as a means to promote understanding, strengthen diplomatic ties, and showcase the rich cultural heritage of the Caribbean and Latin America. Cultural diplomacy between Latin America and the Caribbean is an important facet of regional and international relations aimed at fostering understanding, collaboration, and cultural exchange. The canvas is very broad in terms of its projections. It involves cultural activities, including areas of music and dance, cultural centers and institutions, cultural exchanges and scholarships, cultural diplomacy and international organizations, film and literature, culinary diplomacy, and art and the visual culture. Given the time frame that I have, I will just look at some of the topics there or the themes enumerated. Carnival of Latin America is a key factor and an important platform for interregional cooperation. We have marked similarities in our designs and costuming and our characters. Example, the devil is a recurring element in the carnivals of Dominican Republic, Colombia, and Trinidad and Tobago. Efforts to explore creative talents and new possibilities in this fair were discussed in the first Carnival conference in Barranquilla in 2013, and it involved countries as far as Mexico, Panama, Trinidad and Tobago, and a few other Latin American countries. And to date, that did not lead to greater follow-up action. Follow-up after this event, except for the annual Festival of Fire, which is the Carnival Parade and Conference in Santiago de Cuba. A revival of this concept should be undertaken in this new era of festivals, where peoples of the Caribbean can share in their creativity and develop new possibilities, technical possibilities for improving these festivals. Since Revolution of 1959, Cuba has made its policy to expand cultural institutions. They created more libraries, museums, and the Ministry of Culture directs a program in music, visual arts, and ballet. Cuba is the only Latin American country, from my research, that dedicates or invests great resources towards cultural dissemination in the Caribbean region. In the area of film and literature, Cuba promotes its film industry by utilizing itinerant film units that disperses films throughout the Caribbean region. And we pay homage today to the notable deceased Rigoberto Lopez, who brought one of the most magnificent films to the Caribbean, Roble de Olor, or The Scented Oak, in 2003, and in Carifesta in 2006. So I believe that film festivals in Cartagena and in Havana could also highlight our peoples and our cultures in a very vibrant fashion. The U.W.I Film of School also must be empowered to be able to lead to concrete sort of programs in this regard. The literature of the Caribbean is another area that should be part of our academic sort of studies to give people a greater understanding of the wealth of talent in this area. We have writers from the Caribbean, poets, novelists, who can also be translated and their views shared for greater understanding. The literature of Latin America is diverse and internationally acclaimed. Awards to prize winners in the Nobel area were given to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Vargas Llosa, Pablo Neruda, and similarly there are other areas where Miguel de Cervantes Prize was also awarded to people like Jorge Luis Borges and Octavio Paz. There's a great reserve of knowledge that could be shared to bring our peoples together in greater understanding. In the visual arts, Cuba also has a rich artistic tradition going back to the famous works of Wilfredo Lam, culminating in the diverse magical role of Mendive, Olazabal, and Eduardo Choco Roca Salazar. The latter collaborated with the U.W.I Center of Creative and Festival Arts with a mural entitled Mi Grito, My Cry for Freedom. And this now rests very proudly it shows the commonality of the peoples of Cuba and Trinidad and Tobago, and it is can be seen on the campus student center. I will additionally emphasize heightened promotion for the music and dance genre originating from Latin America and the Caribbean. This integration aims to foster stronger connection within the realm of music and dance, and will also include greater promotion to the music and dance system. Latin American music genres such as salsa, samba, our own soca, Jamaica's dancehall, reggaeton have also gained international recognition, and there should be festivals to celebrate this achievement. In the realm of folk dancing, we have seen again where Cuba has one of the richest and most developed ballet strategies that could benefit our own nascent groups in the Caribbean. The strongest recommendation here is what role can our instrument, the steel band, play in cultural sort of diplomacy. The export of our steel band skills, arrangers and tuners can be shared with these Latin American countries in contributing towards a greater performance level. And I must applaud the steel band of Cobre in Santiago de Cuba for taking the art form to the highest level with teaching and steel instruments supplied from Trinidad and Tobago. It is imperative for governments to collaborate in cultural exchanges between institutions of higher learning and cultural centers. And this is another area where the university, and I'm extensively speaking now about Institute of International Relations, we can afford to have our students be exposed through travel to the Latin American countries to better gain an understanding in terms of their politics and in terms of their trade, in terms of their culture. So the canvas is very broad, but there are obviously problems involved in terms of funding. Most of the missions abroad do not dedicate large resources towards cultural diplomacy, and there must be an expanded role for cultural collaboration in this regards. Teaching and research also should be expanded for greater collaboration in the area of culture, exchange of scholars, and the role of missions in our territories should be given that kind of portfolio to make culture a very almost mandatory in the way forward. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cowie. And now to our final speaker, Mr. Michael Hendrickson.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and the fellow panelists. I'm very happy to be here to give a few thoughts on this at this very important forum on fostering socioeconomic development, trade, and investment. I would like to begin with a quote from the famous Trinidadian and international statesman, C.L.R. James, who said that in the Caribbean, politics, economy, and society are 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. I think it's very apt for this whole session that we have to integrate the 3 planks of politics, economy, and society. Now, at the outset, what we find is that the optimal development of socioeconomic, technological, and cultural cooperation between Latin America and the Caribbean really remains a missed opportunity. The natural advantages that have been presented by similar history, culture, geographical proximity really have not been leveraged to the extent that they can be to build bridges of integration and cooperation. And so trade and investment and social and cultural cooperation between the two regions has really languished over time. In this presentation, I would like to put forward a few key takeaways. First, on the multipolarity and what it means, and then I'll look a bit at trade and investment and the gaps there in the region, and then put forward a few suggestions as to how we can strengthen trade, investment, and cultural and socio-economic cooperation. What exactly does multipolarity mean for us? And how can we cope and develop the kind of defensive and sometimes aggressive strategy that we would need to cope in the New World Order? Abdul Said in Modern Diplomacy defined multipolarity as the distribution of power in more than two states in terms of military, cultural, and economic power and influence. And we are seeing that live and direct, where the axis of power is shifting from the west to the east, and there's some amount of diffusion, centered around the Belt and Road and other initiatives. I think for the Caribbean and Latin America, multipolarity means certain key things. First, we are finding that there's a slowing of the wheels of trade and globalization, a kind of process of deglobalization. And what you're finding is that major powers are reverting to protectionism, and in some cases, old-style industrial policy to safeguard their leading sectors. This is evident in the United States infrastructure bill, and China has had its response in a $2.3 trillion infrastructure and other sector investment in 2023. The Belt and Road Initiative in itself is a part of China's policy of expanding its reach and global influence in many theaters of activity. A second important thing that we are seeing is the coaling of states. And in the Caribbean, we're going to have to be very mindful of this. Sometimes with veiled and sometimes not so veiled threats, and forcing or encouraging countries to take sides in the battle for global supremacy and hegemony. The third thing is that the prospect for increased policy space there might be the prospect for this, given that spaces are opening up following the 1945 arrangements, which had the United States and other Western powers as the leading arbiters of influence in the global scene. And I think this is important for the Caribbean, because it might just open more policy space for us to prosecute our development in our own interests. The fourth thing is that there's going to be an increasing importance of value chains and inter-industry trade. And I think based on knowledge, skills, technology, and innovation, in some sectors like tourism, it is predicted by a number of analysts that there's going to be hyper competition. And so the Caribbean is going to have to position this sector in a more strategic way going forward. Now, these potential changes reduces the space for the Caribbean in terms of negotiation. But, we are going to have to be strategic in what we do. And we know that trade has not realized its potential in the Caribbean, Latin America and the Caribbean. And that is something that we're going to have to address frontally. The value of CARICOM exports to Latin America averaged just over 1.98 billion between the decade of 2003 to 2012. The trade balance was a deficit of about over $1.33 billion. Now, the Caribbean would have to work to see how it can adjust that. I think there are a number of areas of partnership where both regions can benefit. It's not a winner-take-all situation, and there must be efforts to leverage that. So because in reality, we really haven't performed the way that we should in a large market like Latin America with 600 million people and a GDP of over $5 trillion. The Caribbean really has the potential to increase its trade. There's also a need for the Caribbean to upgrade and diversify its production structure so that it can better enter the Latin American market. When we look at the Trade Complementarity Index, which measures the extent to which our exports in CARICOM are matching the imports of Latin America, we find that they remain relatively low at about 25% out of 100%. The index is scaled by percentage. And this has fallen off during the pandemic. So that is a really serious area of concern. But interestingly, there's a counterintuitive thing, because the situation is that the index is similar to that for Europe and United States in the decade before the pandemic, which shows that we already had some benchmarks for leveraging the Latin American market. So we already have an Asian foothold, and that is something we really need to galvanize and see how we could strengthen. In terms of investment, the data is scarce, but investment in the region from the UNCTAD report has grown significantly, in the last few years. Coming up, there's been a bounce back after the pandemic. But what we're not seeing a similar uptake in terms of Caribbean investment. There have been nascent investment in tourism, in agriculture coming out of Brazil, in green energy, but these can definitely be catalyzed in a more significant way. In the interest of time, let me go quickly. What can we do now as a region to advance our development on multiple fronts? I propose a few things. First, we need to look at how we can strengthen cooperation in trade. And for this, I think we need an omnibus trade agreement. It's no longer sufficient for Latin America and the Caribbean to continue with these partial scope agreement, which really, in effect, really do not do much in terms of really substantially improving the production structures and greasing the wheels of trade. We need an omnibus agreement which includes goods, services, intellectual property, technology transfer, and importantly, cultural and social cooperation. Of course, this should be built on a model of special and differential treatment with some carve-outs for CARICOM in important sectors such as agriculture to ensure food security, sectors like the poultry sector, root crops, and some areas of financial services where we are definitely quite vulnerable. Secondly, transport linkages which grease the wheels of trade need to be strengthened. Transport and logistics remain a major problem. As we know, the Panamax has come into being, and only a few ports in the Caribbean, for example, Jamaica and a few others have really been Panamax ready, the Bahamas. So we really need to improve our transport and logistics. We need to incentivize this. I do not think that this can be left only to the private sector. It would require public-private partnerships to incentivize investors to invest in shipping, to get the shipping links to move agricultural, manufactured, and other products between the two regions. The Copa Airlines, for example, is already a major hub, now replacing Miami as a central hub in terms of tourism and other trade with the Caribbean. And that is something we need to leverage and look at how to interlink Copa in a hub and spoke arrangement with our own Caribbean regional airlines. Thirdly, business-to-business links must be developed. And I think there's high time for a joint CARICOM Latin America Business Bureau and Forum to explore opportunities for investment that could boost incomes and employment for our citizens. Joint ventures should be encouraged between large Latin American firms and smaller, more vulnerable Caribbean firms so that they can learn the tricks of the trade in production and exchange, and and marketing and other areas. This would certainly help some of our vulnerable producers to enter certain markets. For example, there's a clear opportunity for e-commerce, and because a number of our producers simply are not competent and fully equipped in this area to put their products online and trade online. On the social front, there needs to be strengthened cultural cooperation, language programs, and I think there should be a similar replica protocol, like the cultural protocol under the CARIFORUM EPA. I think there's room for a similar cultural protocol to encourage the free movement of artists and cultural practitioners between Latin America and the Caribbean to practice their trade and to make money. Because we know, for example, reggae artists do quite well in Brazil, Argentina, and other areas. Soca can do well, and Calypso can do well there. So we need to open up those spaces for people. Finally, in terms of this point, I think there's a critical role for the universities and for the academy and educational institutions in both regions to establish both formal and informal links to undertake joint research, knowledge sharing, exchange programs of students. You know, this is something that this is an opportunity that is another missed opportunity. For example, programs in green energy, disaster management, biodiversity conservation, teaching methods and pedagogy in mathematics, physics, and other areas, crime and security. I think all of these are critical and vital value-added areas which we can focus on. Finally, I would just like to stress that when we're looking at this development cooperation, we must not lose sight of the fact that what we are trying to do. Development cooperation is not an end in itself, but rather we are trying to merge and create an improved standard of living for our people and to improve the cultural confidence and assurance of our people on the world stage. And I think we should not lose sight of that. And so as we reposition ourselves in this multipolar world, we must bring our people on board in a practical and circumstantial way, people at all levels and cross-sections of our society, so that they can be a part of our development. Thanks again for having me to say a few words.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Michael. Our final speaker, you have thrown out a number of very, very interesting ideas. And so now we need to maximize the time that we have for discussion, for responding to, commenting on, and possibly posing some questions to our panelists. Now, unfortunately, we have lost some of them. Both Dr. Stacey Ann Richards Kennedy and Dr. Curtin were forced to leave us early because they had overlapping commitments. But we do have 3 panelists who are present with us still, and I think we should take every opportunity to engage with them. Now, let's see if there are any questions coming in. I'm encouraging all members of our audience to send in their questions and comments. I think they maybe need a little bit more time to get their thoughts organized. But in the meantime, I wanted to address 2 questions of my own. The first is to Dr. LaGuardia. And I appreciated your presentation very much. I wanted to ask one thing, though, and it concerns some of the challenges that regional integration in the Latin American context is currently facing. And some of this is due, of course, to a very volatile political environment and to the considerable impacts, sometimes unforeseen, which political changes may have on the capacity for integration and cooperation. And I wondered now I noticed that you said that UNASUR is still in existence, but in a frail way. And you also expressed the hope that CELAC can play a more vibrant role. And I wanted to ask you if you see that those possibilities as being strong in the light of recent electoral outcomes. We have seen very recent government changes, both in Argentina and in Ecuador. And to what extent will develop, of course, the one in Ecuador, we are not sure. There's a lot of uncertainty because this government will only be there for 18 or this presidency will only be there for 18 months. But what is the potential for continuing major uncertainty in renewing regional cooperation in South America in the light of a very volatile political climate? That would be my question to you. And of course, it has implications for the Caribbean, because some Caribbean countries were members of UNASUR, and all Caribbean countries are members of CELAC. And I wanted Michael to elaborate a bit more on the potential for trade and services in particular. Well, potential for trade and services as the main thing, but also the ways in which we can increase our cooperation with Latin America on the question of food security. But in terms of trade and services, transport and logistics, you made some key points there, and I would love to hear more about the role that Panama can play in terms of addressing our major air transport restrictions in the Caribbean, and the marketing of educational services. And to what extent have our universities, our institutions in the Caribbean really tapped into the Latin American market? And, you know, it's not simply the universities, but it's also, it requires a change of approach in public institutions in general. If you're going to pitch educational services, all our governments, including our immigration services, must be prepared to welcome a larger influx of foreign students from the continent, from the Latin American continent. Have we really done much in that regard in the Caribbean? And I remember when I was a teenager, Latin Americans used to come to boarding schools in the Caribbean to learn English. What has happened to all of that? Have we forgotten all of those services that we used to offer and that we used to trade in terms of educational services and cooperation? So I would start there, and I see that there are some other questions. There's another question coming in from Hensley Daniel. Is the language difference between CARICOM and Latin America hindering the widening and deepening of cooperation? I am sure both Dr. Cowie and the other panelists as well would have something to say on that count. So over to the three of you.
Well, thank you, Professor Byron. I believe I was the first that talked among the three remaining panelists, so I will start. Thanks for the question. Well, related to Latin American regionalism and how political changes have an impact. We know that the Latin American systems, there is a strong presidential impact in terms of conducting foreign affairs. And the country's approaches to regionalism also are very much impacted then by the changes on governments and the president that is running the country at the moment that we are talking about. A clear example is CELAC. The only time that a member of CELAC withdrew from CELAC with Brazil under Bolsonaro. So here we have a very clear example of how these changes in governments in Latin America more committed to central right or extreme right positions. They have also a tendency of not appreciating the value of regionalism. They prefer to engage in bilateral relations and going to traditional extra-regional actors that are perceived are more beneficial for their own interests and what they believe should be the interest of the country. And the Bolsonaro case is a very clear one. UNASUR followed the same path. We already know that UNASUR was at the verge of almost non-existent. And it is in 2023 that there is a political will expressed by Argentina and Brazil with Alberto Fernandez and Lula that they decided that they will re-engage in the UNASUR, in UNASUR. And now Petro has also declared that they are also exploring on how to participate in UNASUR. But now we have this change in Argentina's new political map. So is that commitment from Argentina actually have an impact on UNASUR revitalization or not? We don't know. I believe that if there is something that we might start also exploring in Latin America should be a type of presidential regionalism. We have a lot of adjectives to define regionalism, but presidential regionalism is something that we might need to actually start looking into the region because, and this is quite, I believe this is a major challenge that we have because there is no a serious commitment to regionalism with these changes in these approaches from countries to what should be a long-term process. So definitely these changes in Latin America are having a real impact. And now with these changes, especially in a large actor as Argentina, we need to see what might be happening in the region. And a final note in that, I know that there were, and I have a lot of expectations on regaining a momentum on regionalism and Latin American Caribbean relations after the new turn to the left. But the truth is that we need to understand that the left of today is not the left of the beginning of the 21st century. Not even Lula could be the same because the context has changed tremendously. So we also need to understand the domestic challenges that Latin American and Caribbean countries are facing to understand the potentials of regionalism and the relations and try to make the best of the difficult context that we have. But nevertheless, even if we have these challenges, I believe that there is a tremendous potential for Latin American and Caribbean regionalism cooperation that we need to insist on make that happening because the world is quite and far too complicated for us not trying to come together as a region to face many challenges that we have. Prof, you're muted.
My apologies. I said, thank you very much. And I think that we need to think back to Professor Serbian's comments. He spoke a lot about the challenges of the disparities and the cross-cutting interests in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the fact that we have to focus on transcending some of those. Can we proceed to the other two panelists to address the questions so far?
Yes. In terms of trading services is definitely an opportunity that is not being optimized. If we look at it, we'll call it a missed opportunity. And it has to do with a lot of barriers, in terms of the modes of supply, cross-border supply, the commercial presence of setting up companies. We haven't really done much in that. We really need a proper services protocol, which would have some amount of liberalization, but what I would call sensitive liberalization, with some amount of safeguards, recognizing the huge disparity in levels of development and size and scale economies between the two regions. But we can't continue to ignore that. We need to, have people be able to supply by the different modes, online, e-commerce, commercial presence, movement of natural persons, cross-border supply, and so on. So we need that, but we need a services protocol. I think right off the bat, there's clear potential for tourism, cultural services, some aspects of professional services and technological services, some financial services. I know Republic and some of the banks in Trinidad and Tobago have made some foray into Central America, but there's definitely scope for that. Educational services, which you mentioned, which we used to do pretty well. And even in Trinidad, there used to be a number of institutes, foreign language institutes, and there used to be a brisk two-way partnership and exchange between Colombia, I know, and Trinidad and Tobago. Students from Trinidad and Tobago going to Colombia to learn Spanish, and Colombians and other Latin Americans coming to learn English, and that seems to have sort of diminished over time. So that is something we really need to look at. How do we facilitate this? How do we encourage it? As you rightly said, there's a major problem in terms of our border issues. As you know, during the 2007 World Cup, we implemented a travel passport to facilitate people moving across the region smoothly and easily. But for some reason, we didn't think that is good enough for our people. So it was terminated after, and that is something that we need, something like that again, so that when you land in Jamaica, you're processed there, and you could pretty much move along the train to the Caribbean. Once you're vetted in terms of, you're not any security threat, and you don't have anything, any obvious red flags. So we will need that in order to encourage, the kinds of investment from Latin America. The air transport is, as you said, is a major bugbear, as you know, in terms of layer. Just to give you my example, last year I was going home and I had to go to Panama, overnight in Panama, go to St. Martin, overnight there, spend 2 days, and then take a boat to get to Nevis, right? So it's the air transport is something we really need to look at. I think Panama is opening opportunities in terms of Copa, but I think other airlines need to come on board, and we need to develop a cooperation and a hub and spoke arrangement where we could move passengers across the region, with Panama being a hub. Air transport is not the only thing. We need to open up sea transport. For example, in Belize, you have a lot of agricultural produce which are spoiled, but because of the cost of shipping and because you don't have the container lines on a regular basis, that is an opportunity missed, where we could have been moving products into the tourism sector, into the Eastern Caribbean. So that is something we need to look at. Yes, we need to look at how our institutions, the business climate, the business environment, what kind of public policies are in place to facilitate this. Government's going to have to be on board. They're going to have to get ideas from the private sector as to what are some of the barriers and how they can be removed. But it's something which we have to start doing piece by piece. I think there are a couple of things that we can do, low-hanging fruit in the short term, but in the medium term, we definitely have to get the transport issue, get it solved. It's something that definitely is going to hinder trade, investment, cultural cooperation, and all aspects of our development. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Cowie, I'm coming to you. I would just like to add one thing, though, before. No, it's funny. We think that we have tremendous language disparities to overcome. But I live in St. Kitts and Nevis. And if I walk down any street in either island now, I hear more Spanish than English. I hear Dominicano music blaring out from bars. I see school children coming down the road from the local high school, and they're speaking Spanish. They're not speaking English. They live here and they speak English as well, but they are probably of Dominicano origin. I can sit down in a Cuban restaurant and have Cuban food if I want. And, we have every opportunity to learn Spanish and to learn French. There are Haitian security guards around the banks. Their English is perfect. I think that we have the terrible inherited English refusal to speak other languages. And over to you, Dr. Cowie.
There's a reluctance because we have an English language that is global, but the thing must be structured. There must be built-in mechanisms in our university programs, in our high school programs, where the student can have some period of internship in the country. And this is where universities have played a very pivotal role in terms of cooperation, right? This has been bandied around for the longest while, but it must be systematically organized, and there must be facilities from the receiving countries to allow that kind of archery. There still are problems, visa requirements, there are problems with a recognized entity within the country to have that reciprocity. So until we get some of these things structured, we are still will be repeating this ad nauseum. So I think again about the question of hearing Spanish or French in the streets. That is okay for language of survival. But when you get to a forum where you wish to express yourself in an educative, almost native context, you have to go to the country in question. And there must be that kind of area of to facilitate that.
Thank you. No, there are two new questions. There is from Liana Silochan. She asks, are there any distinguishable features of Latin American film that can be borrowed and used in digital communications in the wider Caribbean region? Any characteristics that might be useful in broadcasting messages on a digital platform? And then, so I'll leave that to the panel to address. And also Dr. Montoot, I think, has both a question and comments that she would like to make.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. Fascinating discussions and debates going on there. So many things stand out to me, but I can't talk about all of them, so I'll talk about, those that are maybe closest to my heart. And that is the issue of transportation. Mr. Hendrickson, thank you for highlighting this. When I think about how we try to address regional integration, we are reducing barriers to trade, we are reducing tariffs and so, but we do not have the physical infrastructure. And maybe we need to start thinking about not replacing our model of regional integration, but having a complement with the physical integration, because without that, we are not going anywhere. And that reminds me of a very insightful presentation complementing yours by the Secretary General of the ACS. We had a China Caribbean seminar with the Alpha Lockjack School of Business, and there was a fascinating presentation, and there were maps about how this could be done. And I'm very happy that this has been brought up here today again. The other issue and the other question/issue or comment is that I wonder if, in terms of our struggles with regional integration, whether it's in the sub-regions like the OECS, CARICOM wide, and even going wider with CELAC, and so we have thought about going to the very root of what are the drivers of collective action, because there is research out there. Research has been done about the factors that have been found to have worked for regional integration or regional cooperation to work effectively. So, for example, it is known, at least from research and from trends, when large groups of countries or many countries come together, the prospect or the potential of that regional integration scheme being successful or effective is not as likely as when countries start small, a small group of countries start and then you broaden. The other thing is about giving up of sovereignty. When countries have to give up the sovereignty, and that is why we have the problem about institutionalization and the absence or lack of it, because countries are not likely, the research is showing that countries are not willing to readily give up sovereignty, whether it is the financial commitment they have to make or the sort of rights or privileges that they have as sovereign states to international organizations. And there are several other drivers of successful collective action. I'm wondering if part of the answer is to go into the very root of what it is that drive collective action, what have been known to have enhanced or strengthened or sustained regional cooperation and integration in really deciding how to do regional integration, which countries on what issues, and the scope and that sort of thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Montoot. Just one thing. In Professor Serbin's presentation, he spoke about the decline in neoliberal globalization and strategies, the sort of strategic regionalism, or what, well, he didn't say this, but the leader of the Federal Reserve spoke the other day about friendshoring, about encouraging strategic alliances with people who are your friends, which is what the United States is promoting more and more. I'm not a great fan of friendshoring, but in line with what you're saying, it must be that there are various countries and business partners and so on in Latin America that would be attractive or amenable to collaboration with some parts of the Caribbean. If if we continue your line of thinking. Over to the panel.
Well, I just would like to address the question that has been posed on the chat by Liana Selosian, one of our former alumni as well. So welcome to the seminar. Just very a quick note here. I believe that there is a difference between Latin America and the Caribbean concerning the film industry, and I believe cultural industries in general. And that was highlighted already by Professor Cowie. And I believe that in Latin America, we have a more organized and regional links and regional cooperation to promote culture and arts. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I believe that there is a stronger institutional history on how to do that. And an example thinking about movies is the Latin American Film Festival. It is going to start, I believe, in a few days in Havana. It has been going on for years, based with the strengths as well of the Latin America School of Movies. And the interesting thing here is that even if we have had Caribbean filmmakers that have been trained in this international Latin American school in Cuba, there is little representation of Caribbean cinema, independent cinema in the Latin American Film Festival. And in the Latin American Film Festival, we have the films that are in competition, of course, but we have a lot of parallel showings of movies. We have an European segment. I mean, these movies cannot compete because the competition is for Latin America. But we have European movies that they have their segment. We have movies coming from Asia that have their segments. And how come that we do not have a Caribbean segment in the Latin American Film Festival in Havana, just around the corner, especially when you have Caribbean filmmakers trained in Havana? So those are part of the little things that we need to explore, because there are possibilities to have a stronger and wider relationship, and sometimes we just don't see it. So this is also part of we be more, I believe, aware of possibilities that exist, and that we are not making the best of these opportunities that we have.
Dr. Cowie?
Very much with Professor LaGuardia's intervention. And I would like to say that we at U.W.I, and particularly during my period here, we are developing a bank of Latin American film based on a lot of production coming out of University of Missouri on Caribbean icons and many documentaries, which will allow students to access them without having any difficulty. The question is, we are presently, I mean, the figure is into 100, and we are building up this sort of a reserve, and I'm sure that they'll be available once we get the programs up and running in Latin American studies.
Thank you. Michael, I think you might have something to say. but I want to, before you start saying it, there is a new question that has just come in from Michael Lashley. In Latin America and the Caribbean, how can we leverage our LAC resources to increase and strengthen our collective food security? So let us start with Michael Hendrickson on that, and I invite the other panelists to weigh in if they would like to.
Yes, well, the food security issue is an important one. I recall attending a conference in Costa Rica some time ago, where the Minister of Agriculture of Brazil made a fascinating presentation about the research that was taking place in different types of crop varieties, animal production, climate resilient varieties, and so on. And I think this is something that we probably haven't taken up in the Caribbean, and we have to look at our food production systems and exactly what we can do. I know CARICOM had looked at under the JAGDU initiative, there was a plan to make cassava one of the staple sources of carbohydrate, but I don't know where that is right now, to replace to a significant degree wheat flour and other externally imported grains. So I think that is something we need to look at. In terms of the climate question which we are facing, we're definitely going to have to look at drought-resistant crops and crops that can be farmed in different environments. We're going to have to look at disease and pest infestation and how we build up resilience to this in terms of indoor animal production. Now, Brazil is doing a lot of work in this area. And I think there's it's high time for the Caribbean to field a formal cooperation mechanism to go for our practitioners, the university, the caddies, and so on, for people to understudy and to take back some of these lessons. If we recall, the Institute of Tropical Agriculture was right here in Trinidad and Tobago at one point doing significant research in tropical diseases, tropical production, and what it took. And we have fallen way back. We were on the front burner in terms of the black Barbados black-bellied sheep, the buffalipso, the Antiguan black pineapple, and so on. We were on the cutting edge of doing a serious agricultural research, and I think we need to get back into that, into the research and the practice and the practicalities of agricultural production. There needs to be the advocacy to get our people to understand that with this wave of NCDs that we are facing, we need to eat better. I remember some time ago, a gentleman, Gaskin was his name. He did some research, I think it was published in one of those ethnic medicine journals, which show that, especially for Caribbean people, we need to eat what we produce in the region because it's better for our diet in terms of the NCDs. So we need to eat our own local starches and our coconut oil, contrary to what they tell us that coconut oil is bad, which was really a ploy to swamp the region with soy oil and to kill our coconut oil industry. So we need to do the advocacy too. And then governments have a role to play there, because government procurement can lead the way. If government encourages the farmers, I know in Trinidad and Tobago, the government was trying to amalgamate farms and so on. Guyana has significant potential for doing that. Then we can procure more of our local production if we amalgamate and get the economies of scale from these farms, because you're always going to face the problem of people saying, oh, but you can't produce in the scale, to really compete with what is coming from North America or the regions. So I think the food security issue is a serious thing. I think the government has to lead. They has to incentivize the private sector to come on board, and then we have to match that with the transport to move the food, that surplus food, across the region. Thanks.
Dr. Cowie?
Presently, there's joint research between Department of Agriculture and U.W.I and institutions in Latin America, mainly Peru, where we're looking at areas of potato variety, and it's a massive amount of different variety of potatoes in that area. And in terms of food and protein-based animal production, the Pakibara, the Quis, and others, there have been efforts being made and research done to have these as substitutes with less fat and more sort of easily bred. And this is ongoing, and I know that literature is there and can be provided for the person making the question. And I'll be very much happy to put him on to Professor Emeritus Gary Garcia, who has written extensively on the area of food security. And we're now developing a course for the Latin American Studies Program, Food Science and Security in Latin America, which is already being designed. So there is abundant work being done to see how Latin America can offer us some kind of relief. My other question to the other panelists is the question of the aftosa, the foot and mouth disease. Many of these things are being introduced to put barriers to our exports from the region. So that's something that has to be explored. What are the barriers for us having that sense of independence when a lot of the raw materials are coming from other European countries?
Thank you. Just two comments. Well, the first is that I recall that over the last few years, I have consistently seen very good scholarships being offered by Mexico in particular in the area of agricultural science to Caribbean students. And unfortunately, many of these scholarships, I'm speaking now of the OECS countries, were not sufficiently taken up. But they were excellent scholarships. They were on very specialized areas of agricultural science. And I was always concerned that we were throwing away valuable opportunities to upgrade technical skills in those areas. And that, of course, is a vital part of Latin American, Caribbean, South-South cooperation. And I also wanted to mention that there are, Michael, you'll be happy to know, there are a lot of cottage industries in producing cassava flour in many of our countries. At the same time, you know, at where I come from, St. Kitts and Nevis, I see a large importation of cassava bread these days from the Dominican Republic. And the same, I am sure that a long time ago, our migrants there took the skill of making cassava bread to the Dominican Republic. And now, many of us have lost that skill, but cassava bread is coming back to us from La República Dominicana. I would like to read to you as well a greeting from Mirna Yonis, who is listening from Venezuela. Best regards from Caracas, Venezuela. A real pleasure to have listened to this session. Unfortunately, I missed the first presentations. I congratulate the quality of the presentations of distinguished panelists, and I congratulate the IIR for the organization and quality of this panel. Today's connectivity is wonderful. Mirna Yonis, Central University of Venezuela. Thank you, Mirna. And there's another question, which must be our last. How can we get the young people from CARICOM and Latin America to work closely to develop sports and cultural activities? I'll throw that out to the panel, and after that, we'll ask Dr. Montut to give us her blessing before we leave. Panel, over to you. Sports and culture.
Well, just I know that we are running out of time, so in a very brief recommendation will be actually to create the opportunities to do that. I believe that there are several opportunities that we can invite people from Latin America to the Caribbean, even if it's not for competing, but at least to share the space, to have like, in terms of sport, to train together. This is how you build also relationships. This is how you learn. So it is not about creating more spaces, but to analyze which are the opportunities that we can use from the spaces, the events that we have that we might not be using. Thinking, for instance, Carifesta. Carifesta could also try to enlarge a little bit and invite some Latin American representation that is linked to Caribbean tradition. There is many of that if we think in the greater Caribbean area. So why not to do that? So little steps can make a major difference, especially again, not to create something new. We don't need many resources to do that. We just need to be creative and use what we already have in place.
Thank you, Dr. LaGuardia. Michael?
Yes, I mean this is a very important thing. And yes, we have to put the facilitation in place, plain and simple. There's no reason why we can't have teams in football and basketball, rugby, and the other sport, tennis, moving across to Latin America and competing and upgrading their skills. But we have to make it easy for people to move in terms of the visa requirements. We have to be creative in terms of probably putting on bulk flights with a cheaper rate so that more people can move. We have to upgrade our facilities so that would encourage teams, from Latin America, to feel that they come into a world-class facility to compete. And generally, we need a strong overall cultural protocol which would facilitate these kinds of exchanges. For example, providing short courses in Spanish, working knowledge of the language, practical working knowledge of the language, so that you could interface if you travel to the country. So, I mean, I think as Dr. LaGuardia said, the wheels are already there, but, some of these little things can help to facilitate it more.
I must indicate that there are protocols that already exist for sporting sort of a cultural cooperation. Mexico has a very strong and vibrant system there, the SEDOM, and so does Cuba. In fact, a lot of things are happening without sort of fanfare. We have students involved in the football training. We have coaches from Cuba with the government, Trinidad, Tobago, Cuba, having brought their coaches to us in Trinidad and Tobago. Our first javelin medalist, gold medalist, was trained by one of the top Cuban scholars there. So I think that the question is, what kind of channels will you use to sort of accelerate the facilities and the possibilities? And this is where, again, the vibrant organizations must come together and to see what are the needs and how to go through the process.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cowie. And we could say the same for cultural cooperation. I remember in Jamaica, what a tremendous contribution Cuban music teachers, Cuban musicians, and sports coaches, but particularly in the area of culture, the tremendous contribution of Cuban musicians and other artists to cultural life in Jamaica, as well as elsewhere. I'm going to take this opportunity to thank the panel myself for your sterling contributions to us this evening, and to thank the audience for its engagement. And I'll turn over to Dr. Montoute now for her final words. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much, Professor Byron. And I just want to point out some highlights from the presentations and then just say a final closing and thanks. Among the things that were highlighted in this seminar is the shifting or dynamics in the global political economy and the increasing role of developing countries in that context, the Latin American Caribbean region, they're responding to these changing dynamics. And while this broad context poses challenges, it also offers opportunities. And therefore, that brings in the role of CAF. CAF is playing a crucial role in this regard by virtue of its part in facilitating regional integration and promoting growth and sustainable development via a variety of projects. Very important to note is that CAF is an indigenous development bank, and its lending is not based on income-based criteria as our traditional lending institutions. Some priority areas for cooperation highlighted in another presentation were areas of security, food security, energy, education, diplomatic representation, with CELAC being a vehicle through which such cooperation can take place. And another thing was highlighted by one of our presenters is that CELAC can be more effective with greater institutionalization. Nevertheless, CELAC holds much promise, such as the potential for promoting the interests and concerns of the region on the global stage and with powerful actors such as China. CELAC can be leveraged for promoting peaceful resolution of conflict between member states, and the Caribbean possesses valuable assets for strengthening its relationship with Latin America. On the role of culture and arts, we've been told here in this seminar that they play a crucial role in bringing the region together, and the University of the West Indies, in particular the IR, can facilitate this process. What the Caribbean needs to do at this time is to take advantage of the opportunities in the Latin American market, and some of those things that need to be done would include to diversify its economic structure, strengthen cooperation in trade via comprehensive trade agreement, taking into account special and differential treatment, improve transportation and logistics via public-private partnerships, forging inter-business links via the creation of a Caribbean Latin American Business Bureau, and strengthening cultural cooperation to encourage the movement of artists, and collaboration in research and innovation between universities in the two sub-regions. And importantly, that the people of the region must be a part of this process. So all of this must be done bottom up. So to end, I would just like to thank our trusted partner, CPC, and their collaboration on this event. Thank you, Professor Griffith, for acting as this bridge. To our chair, Professor Byron, I want to thank you so much for the great job that you did, just navigating some of the changes that we had to deal with for this seminar. You did an amazing job at this, and for facilitating the discussion, asking questions that led to other questions and comments. So thank you for that, Prof. And to our distinguished panelists, what a rich and insightful discussion. Drs. Curtin, LaGuardia Martinez, Kennedy Richards, from Dr. Sebin's presentation, Dr. Hendrickson and Cowie, thank you so very much. Deepest gratitude to the Marketing and Communications Department. You did an excellent job, as you've always done. Mr. Nisha Charles of the IR Secretariat and other Secretariat staff and the IT personnel for all your valuable contributions. And to you, our esteemed audience, I understand that the Ambassador of Spain, Dominican Republic, and Mexico were there. I don't know if they are still around, but thank you to members of the Diplomatic Corps and all our distinguished attendees and participants. Thank you so much for joining us. We value your interest and support. Thank you very much and have a good evening.